Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's NCVER webinar, The Best of Both Worlds, Integrating VET and Higher Education. I'm Tabitha Griffin, a senior member of the Research and Data Analytics branch here at NCVER, and we are joined today by our two presenters and authors of this report, Dr. Lizzie Knight from Victoria University and Dr. Stephen Hodge from Griffith University. Big welcome to you both. So today's webinar is presenting some recent research that examined highly integrated VET and higher ed qualifications. Of course, interest in this space is not new, and there's been a long history of policies, research projects and reports examining and promoting pathways between the two sectors. And indeed, many of you may be involved in or know examples of integrations that provide a pathway, which is often from VET to higher ed, that a student might navigate. So before we get started, I'll just quickly run through a little bit of housekeeping. To the right of your screen, you should see a control panel where you can select your audio mode and ask questions. And we invite you to submit questions in writing using the questions panel at any time throughout the presentation. For privacy reasons, just note that only we will see your questions. We'll acknowledge all the questions either during the Q&A at the end of today's webinar or via email after the webinar. So I'll now hand over to Lizzie and Stephen to begin today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Tabitha. I'm Stephen Hodge from Griffith University, and I'm joined by my colleague from Victoria University, Lizzie Knight. And we, of course, have prepared this report, and we'll be talking to some parts of the report today. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are all meeting and pay respect to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, what I'll do is I'll provide some introduction to the project first, and that will be followed by an introduction to the research methodology we use. And then after that, we come back to some characteristics of sustainable high integration models that we were able to analyse from our data. The project itself was to explore existing arrangements of integrated VET and higher education qualifications. So that's the first thing to note, is that we're talking about integrated qualifications, and integration, of course, is it's a word that everyone understands. But when we looked more closely at integrated VET and higher education qualifications, the picture was far from clear. So we'll talk more about that later. The project was also exploratory. There have been some wonderful projects done in the past where a lot of data has been produced about pathways, about the many challenges that students, that providers face at the interface between VET and higher education. So this is to explore the idea of an integrated qualification. The research aimed to identify and examine existing arrangements, like I said, of integrated qualifications, and we also took into account entry and exit points to the VET and higher education components of these qualifications. The ultimate goal was to become clearer about how integrated qualifications could be promoted in future, and what sort of conditions constrain integrated qualifications, because really it's a very, very good idea. There's no doubt about it. I'll return to that point. The project itself was conducted in a couple of phases. We used a qualitative approach to identify and describe current approaches for integrating qualifications. So that involved, in part, a desktop analysis of qualification offerings, and we were constrained there to using the web pages that are published by institutions, and that part of the research used that kind of data. We use a snowballing technique to identify examples of higher integration. We did that through consultation with NCVER, the team there, interviews with a range of stakeholders, and as I mentioned, systematic search of provider sites. So we had these three sources of direction about what cases of highly integrated qualifications we could study. And the project included a short survey that was sent to a selection of stakeholders, which included people who are established as experts in the tertiary field broadly. So we undertook that survey to deepen our understanding of what's going on, but also that was a way to discover more cases, potential cases of high integration qualifications. Now, still setting up the introduction to the project here, we've grabbed this term binary tertiary field. Stephen Parker and colleagues used this term in a project in research they published in 2018, and it's a good way to describe the tertiary field in Australia, at least. It's characterised by a sharp division between the sectors. I would say that the bulk of people who are listening to the webinar know only too well that we have two sectors, and it's quite problematic at many levels to make them work together. The sectors have different goals. There's different purposes espoused for each of the sectors. They have different histories, and history is a really important thing here because it builds up the cultures that people work within, that think in terms of, or the many practitioners in both the sectors. The sectors also, of course, they respond to different policy and government frameworks, and they're funded differently. So there are many differences, and to talk about a binary, a sharply divided binary, makes good sense. Now, of course, for a long time, credit transfer and articulation has been the mechanism for overcoming some of the more obvious difficulties for students and other stakeholders who would benefit from movement between the sectors. And there's been research as well on student experiences and their movement between the sectors. And while sometimes that's smooth and unproblematic, in many cases it's not like that at all. The systems that we are talking about make things difficult. They make things difficult for students. They make things difficult for providers, employers, and it goes on. And you can see there we've just grabbed a fairly famous table from the AQF documents, which is one of the ways that this binary is expressed. And of course, the project itself is about qualifications. You can see this kind of crazy paving, as Roger Harrison and team referred to the pathways between the two sectors. Now, the problems thrown up by the sharp binary of the Australian tertiary field have been explored over and over. They've been explored, they've been posed, they've been researched many times. And what we've got here is a selection of contributions to the debate just since the training reform era. So right back to the Finn review of 1991, the binary was identified as a problem, and right back at that stage, policy interest manifested in overcoming the binary. ANTA did good work here, promoting pathways. There was their projects and their policy pronouncements were quite proactive there. A really significant report, the Phillips KPA report of 2006, which is probably for us one of the most informative of the earlier reports, went right into this area, and they attempted a typology as well, or the outline of a typology, explored actual cases of pathways and more tightly integrated qualifications, and made, we think, quite a significant contribution to the debate. I mentioned Roger Harris and team's crazy paving work of 2006. That research, supported by NCVER, focused on the student experience of the binary, and they highlighted how difficult it can be for students who are wanting to work across the interface, the diploma, advanced diploma into associate degree space. Like that's a really important area to traverse, and students were some of them were finding this unproblematic. Others were more perplexed by the way things were set up. The Bradley Review, major policy statement, which also called for pathways. New South Wales government. So the New South Wales government has been doing some incredibly interesting work here. We've mentioned a report from 2010, but we're very interested in the recent institutes that have been set up that promise to create a more robust path between the two sectors. So we're really interested in how that plays out. Moody and colleagues did that work on vocational streams, and of course they had the broad view of this field, and vocational streams naturally freely traverse the AQF. But if you've got this binary operating through the middle of it, you've got artificial problems being created. Fowler's work, 2017. The Ithaca Group's report of 2018 is probably where you would go to get the richest and most up-to-date information about pathways in Australia. So pathways, which is a way of thinking about integration that goes right back to Finn. Pathways, we found many pathways, and all the signs were that there's some wonderful outcomes from pathways that have been established, some going back many years. So we say that at the less integrated qualification end, when we're talking more about pathways between qualifications, that there's established models. People are reasonably well aware of the problems that arise, and there are many pathways that are highly functional. So there's that's not necessarily a problematic area. The focus of our work was on the very highly integrated types of qualifications. And of course, Gonski and Shergold in 2021, another excellent read, and again, helping us to understand the intricate problems around the binary tertiary field. I go now to an overview of the webinar. What I'll do is throw shortly to Lizzie Knight, my colleague on this project, and she'll take us through the methods we used and our model, which is an emergent heuristic model, or a way to think through the complexity of the world of integrated qualifications, just in terms of how we find them, how they're presented, how they're marketed, what sort of public information's out there about them. Of course, there's no systematic collection of data around integrated qualifications. There wasn't a precedent that we could draw on there. So we developed a model that helped us to sort between very promising high integration examples and to understand where pathways sit in a kind of continuum of integrated approaches. We'll spend a bit of time talking about the characteristics of sustainable high integration models from what we were able to gather, and we'll make some comments about prospects for future integration, the challenges that arise, and the kind of support that the sector, that the tertiary field can provide as well. So I'll hand over now to you, Lizzie, and I think I'm changing the slides, so I'll kind of stay in control of that. You just tell me when to change.
That'd be very helpful. Thank you, Stephen. And welcome everyone. It's very good to see you here. And I'm coming to you from the lands of the Kulin people, and I acknowledge the ancestors past and present. And so I'm here to talk a little bit about the methods and to deepen a couple of elements that Stephen's mentioned to you. And I think that both Stephen and I felt really privileged that this was this project had an exploratory element, and I think that was particularly novel and useful. When you look at all those reports which have come before, we made sure to reflect on their methods that they took and their findings, and really sought to try and explore and get under the skin of some of the reasons why the definitions are shifting and do shift often. So I'll just briefly run through. So we had a sort of layered technique, which was also iterative to an extent, that we moved a little bit through phases, but we really progressed through these three phases that are marked on the screen there. We started with this exploratory, quite expansive, but not exhaustive, qualitative approach, which was identifying and describing different approaches to how integrated higher education. And that point Stephen made about there being no national collection across the two fields of higher education and vet was a key starting point for us. How were we to know these where these instances happened? Some previous reports were very useful in case study approach, and we wanted to move towards that, but we also wanted to have something of a systemic view as well. So I'm going to talk in a little bit of detail about how we tried to assure ourselves that we had some feeling of what was happening without knowing for sure. And then I'm going to go do a deep dive into that desktop search really, and then going to finish with some of the detail about how we constructed our case studies, which you'll see and appear in the report, which helped develop the sort of the learnings from the project that Stephen's going to go into afterwards. I'll just sort of start here and sort of concentrate on this first desktop search, where we sort of noticed that there was an issue in the reports and in other documents, that there wasn't necessarily a consistency in language across the country nor across the sectors. And we thought that that was important, that some of this and we drew on sort of understandings, particularly about how students make choices and how employers understand vet courses and other courses, about that language does form how these courses are understood as products and also as opportunities and pathways in the vet market. So this qualitative desktop approach started. We used the tool to search across the internet to look for emerging specific examples of integrated qualifications using a range of synonyms that you can think of in terms of integration, to try and find instances of what integration could be like. And so we did in two ways. We used a different both open search. We were trying to look for kind of examples of search, and then we did a systematic search, which I might talk about a little bit later. But what we looked over, we found many hundreds of websites were visited, and we found about 118, hot, substantial links that we thought warranted further investigations. And we did this with two researchers. And what happened then is we recorded the website, because as we all know, websites are given to change, and we followed a quite well-known methodology with these websites, quite Height and Railsback from 2010, who had a way of sort of looking at websites and collecting their information, and then we progressed and collected it into a research instrument, which was technically known as, I think, as a spreadsheet, and that really enabled us then to do text understanding and text searches, and using NCVER, we produced this beautiful, if colourful, diagram that Stephen's going to reveal to us all now. And so this is a word cloud, which is qualitative in its presentation, but we thought that there is something about this representation, about the words that came up more frequently. Now, the word cloud, the larger the word is, the more frequently it came up. In those over 100 instances, we thought that we're really talking about integrated qualifications and the integration of qualifications. And overwhelmingly, what we felt is this is quite a space where language is contested, and we needed to find, or wanted to find, a way through of understanding what these, because there's no specific language in this overlapping of the two fields, we wanted to find a way of thinking about how we think about these different examples of high integration. And as Stephen says, it's important that we say high integration. So what we thought is, we thought that we'd use a sort of design technique of a heuristic, a design of understanding, what, and it isn't meaningful in and of itself, but it was useful for our thinking about looking at all these many hundreds of examples. Stephen, could you put that up on the screen for us? So this is, and we're sort of very cautious about this and very much not wanting to say this is a place of truth, but this was a methodological device. It was the device that we used in working towards our case studies, in working towards our understanding of the field. And so we have these endorsed model, consecutive, concurrent, embedded, and I'll just draw your attention at the bottom of the slide to that key bracket, should we say? I'm sure there's a mathematical operation that many of you in the room will know, but that in scope bracket, of that we did think that we had to make a scope definition of high integration models that were in scope and that we could move on in terms of in the project. And so these models of consecutive, concurrent, embedded, and you'll see in our report, and so I won't read out the different conditions for all those reports, but in effect, it was whether there was engagement with providers on both sides. So both the higher education and the vocational course had both engaged. It wasn't just a pathway, it was engagement in both sides. And we thought those high integration models were interesting and were generative in terms of understanding what works and what didn't work. And if Stephen moves to the next slide. I think that we did find that there were narratives about sustaining some of these high integration models, which we all know are based on sort of relationships if you're dealing with two providers or two sides of a provider. And there were many that we found out about that had been discontinued. There was, we felt in this table, which you can read more about in our report, the discontinued, which is the navy colour. I'm conscious Stephen's art background, I may not be using the right colour name, but the discontinued colour at the bottom did seem to be making up a higher proportion of concurrent, a higher integration, and all the embedded courses were discontinued. Whereas the consecutive courses that were engagement from both sides, but they weren't as interwoven, did seem to have a longer longevity. But there are many factors in this, and we don't want to sort of necessarily say it's impossible for an embedded course to succeed and to do well. But it was just indicative and helped us by understanding in practice these settings, understand what was useful for challenges and opportunities. And just finishing, Stephen, with all this work brought us to the next stage, really where we were trying to get to is trying to understand these case studies of understanding how could this work. We were guided by the heuristic model, although not stuck to it, and we were informed by in-depth and quite often kind of interview data that sort of from quite a few different positions on each case study, which was very rich, and we're thankful for all those participants who took part in the surveys and the interviews. And we sort of identified an embedded type integration that comprised apprenticeship programs, two concurrent type integrations, an advanced diploma and animal management, and two consecutive of accounting and early childhood. We go into more detail in the report of that, but I'll hand back to Stephen. Thank you very much for find out what else we gathered.
Mute's over here. Okay, thank you very much, Lizzie, for that overview of our methodology. As Lizzie mentioned, it's a field of very complicated language. So if you think about the challenge, if you had to set out right now to find examples of high integration qualifications, how you'd approach that is something that well, we found quite a challenge, because the way that we can get at what's out there is largely dependent on what's being published by providers on the internet. I mentioned that there's not a systematic data collection around this area. And so we were confronted by the problem of identifying possible case study examples. And the heuristic model that Lizzie introduced was a way that we used to try to order the data that we collected, and from that be able to say, well, what does a higher integration type of qualification look like, and are there grades between that and a more open pathway kind of model. Lizzie also showed us a graph that indicated that there is a loss of these higher integration models over time, and we're able to get at that through pages that were still talking about or announcing more integrated qualifications that, upon closer inspection, were no longer offered. Indeed, our case study of a very highly integrated model was discontinued before it even started, and that was very disappointing for us because we'd found it, we'd set up the interviews, and one of the first things we discovered was that the decision had been taken not to run it. So that's a way of talking about some of the challenges that we faced. What comes of what this is introduced is that we focused only on high integration models. And I'd say, as mentioned, the Ithaca research, the recent one, is the full kind of, gives us a full picture of pathway type integrations. So where, providers may work together, but they're not sitting down and mapping their qualifications rigorously. When you come to the higher integration models, that is a part of the process, and we'll talk more about that. That's a fundamental issue, and what I'll do now is just take us through the characteristics of sustainable models now. So, as I was just mentioning, curriculum mapping, or the mapping process that goes on for higher integration qualifications, is an incredibly interesting process. One of the things we discovered straight away was how resource intensive the curriculum mapping is, and what does that mean? Well, we're using the term curriculum in the broadest sense of statements about what students need to learn. And of course, over on the vet side, accredited courses and training packages contain statements of what needs to be achieved through vet. And there's actually quite a lot of different language in the higher ed, on the higher ed side, to talk about the same sort of thing. So curriculum is the broadest term that we can use here, and so that's why we refer to curriculum mapping. But that's what we discovered, was that this mapping process is absolutely critical to a high integration model. And that's because the respective regulators need to see how the integration is conceptualized and realized. So that of course highlights that the different regulatory environments in vet, in higher ed, it creates a layer of challenge here, where you have to create these documents that are unique, highly specific, very detailed documents, and they're resource intensive. So we gathered information about how expensive the process could be, but also how much expertise was required to perform a curriculum mapping and create one of these mapping documents. So it's quite obvious that there's very limited expertise out there to do this, and people who can produce a curriculum mapping document are rare. So it's rare expertise, and then once that expertise has been secured, it's quite resource intensive, as that's what we learnt, to prepare the documents. So examples of qualifications that we were able to study, built from the ground up, always had some kind of mapping process that was an intensive process. In other cases, institutions had built up expertise over time and had greater facility in producing these mapping documents. So there are providers who are good at this, and they've built up this expertise over time. So it's very interesting that we do have pockets of this high, rare expertise within institutions. when we look more closely at the curriculum challenges, there are challenges on both sides, of course. If you're a higher ed person and you look at VET curriculum in that broad sense, you're going to be quite puzzled by the intricate way in which it's presented, the formats that need to be used. Units of competency are not necessarily an approach that educators outside of VET can understand. I know they're designed to be highly understandable, and in fact, they can be understood. They're not exactly obscure, but if you're not used to them, they can be difficult to penetrate. And then if we flip things around, people who are conversant in the language of units of competency, in modules, in training packages, look over on the higher education side and have their own questions about, for example, how loose the curriculum might be on the higher education side, or the special language that seems to be adopted there. And also the fact that different institutions can have quite different approaches to how curriculum is structured on the higher ed side. So we have a benefit there in VET of a broadly accepted way of expressing occupational knowledge and skills, are nuanced by the fact that we do have accredited courses that can use the unit or module template, but it's quite a uniform kind of model there. And then you go over to the higher ed side, and it really depends on which institution you look at, what you have to then decode. So it's on both sides, these curriculum challenges. In the report, we went into some detail regarding the difficulty from the side of disciplinary knowledge or occupational knowledge, like we might see in a higher education course, and the way occupational knowledge is represented in for example, a training package. But there are very real challenges going back the other way. We spoke to a tertiary field expert who described an example where the higher education people with their bachelor degree insisted that a certain subject was taught in the first year. There was possibly no reason why it had to be taught in the first year, but because they thought it had to be taught in the first year, it then made it much more difficult for an articulation arrangement to be developed out of the diploma, the relevant diploma. So we've got these issues coming from both sides, and of course there's ongoing change on both sides. When a training package changes, then these mapping documents have to be revisited. And what we could see from our discussions with some with institution representatives is an anxiety about changes coming to training packages, and knowing that will have repercussions for both sides of an integrated qualification. So the word that a major change was coming was something that could create some anxiety for people in institutions. So ongoing change was another challenge that we I'm sorry about that. There's thank you cursor that's drifting around there.
Hi Stephen.
Relationships.
I just thought I'd interrupt there and just let you know that we're getting quite close to the end of time, so maybe we'll just move through these next few slides fairly quickly,
of course.
so that we can get to the question.
Brilliant. Okay, Tabitha. Well, okay, so we've talked about curriculum mapping. Relationships was another part of the puzzle. What we found important for successful integrated qualifications was obviously good relationships, but the developing good relationships between provider staff was only one part of the puzzle. Provider staff can sit within institutions where the rest of the staff just don't understand what's going on. So people in higher education institutions who were involved in integrated qualifications had to contend with biases within their institution that view VET in a certain way. And then on the VET side, people working with higher education providers were again viewed in a certain way by the rest of the staff. So we've got within institutions, we've got complications around relationships, but what was really, really important were good relationships that were renewed regularly. Now, industry relevance, another important part of the puzzle. Industry relevance here is about industry finding both the VET and the higher ed parts of an integrated qualification valuable. We had examples of integrated qualifications that were under duress or had been discontinued, and the reason was that industry wasn't in the habit of using or recognising, for example, a higher education qualification. That wasn't part of the long-term thinking about skills in their industry. So industry does need to recognise both parts of a qualification for these things to be more successful. And then finally, student acceptance. Some of the rules around rules coming from higher education or VET could create issues for students. So for example, in the early childhood education and care area, we found that students were put in a fairly difficult situation by the demands of an integrated qualification, because they had to go back into these centres in a voluntary capacity to satisfy hours of work placement. So students as well need to find these integrations acceptable, and when they do, this is one of the ingredients for successful integrations. Now, what I might do is actually leave it there for now. Perhaps go to some of the questions that Tabitha is receiving, so that we can address some of those. So I might hand back to you, Tabitha, now.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Yes, we did have quite a few questions come through already, and although we're almost at the end of the formal time for the webinar, we will spend a little bit of time going through some of these. If people need to go, rest assured that we're recording this, so you can always come back on and listen to the Q&A session. And also, if you haven't yet sent through a question and you've got something you'd like to know, please do send them through. So I've combined a few of these questions. Some of the early questions were really about pathways, and as Stephen and Lizzie already described, this study was more focused on highly integrated examples. So I won't go through those too much, but there has been some interest, and I'm combining a few questions into one here, about other examples that combined, that included work-based learning, and also the role of industry in supporting these types of integrations, just how important that is. And you touched on it already, but if you could expand on that a little bit and maybe provide any other examples where there was work-based learning involved.
Yes, Lizzie, did you want to? I'll talk to the industry support question, because that is that is a very rich area that we studied. And Lizzie, what jumped out for you around work-based learning? Lizzie, are you muted?
I was muted. So that's a work-based learning in itself. No,
Yes.
but I think there's a rich history and future for work-based learning in both vocational and higher education, and emerging policy and practice about both. And I think that I would just sort of refer to Tabitha's earlier comments in terms of this was very much about high integration of the qualification types, and so work-based learning appeared on both sides of many of the integration models. I'll pass back to you, Stephen.
Yeah. So it's a really good question. One of the reflections we would have is that it wasn't just any higher education qualification or just any vet qualification that were finding their way into these highly integrated arrangements, but rather certain kinds of higher ed and certain kinds of vet. And on the higher ed side, we were talking more about the explicitly vocational types of qualifications. So of course, higher ed is profoundly vocational. It's just not, that's not the language it necessarily uses. And so when we're talking about nursing, for example, or early childhood education and care, work-based, work-integrated, work experience components are already a part of those qualifications and necessarily in the vet side as well. So there was a general tendency for the more vocationally oriented higher ed qualifications to be drawn into these arrangements, and they were already quite pro work experience. Lizzie mentioned the future of this. Of course, higher ed is waking up to the value of work integrated learning, work-based learning. So we'll see much more of that in future, I think, and that is fertile ground for future integrated qualifications, or people more able to talk about this on the higher ed side. When it comes to industry support, this is in fact a complex area. So the case study that's written up in the report was a case study that was stimulated in the first place by industry. So it was an industry initiative that created the highly integrated program that, as I mentioned before, had already been discontinued by the time we were talking with the institution representatives. So industry support is it's necessary at the ground level and probably at higher levels as well. So very high level industry support, such as initiating a highly integrated qualification arrangement, is obviously that can go all the way to producing a whole qualification, but the people making the decisions on the ground about employing graduates and funding places on these kinds of qualifications, you need that kind of support as well. So if there's not a custom of utilising both the vet and the higher ed sides of an integrated qualification, it's more problematic. Okay, so we need probably the strategic level support and the everyday support of funding people to go into these qualifications if that's what it takes, and in employing graduates from these qualifications too.
Thanks very much, Stephen. The next question, and again, I've combined a few people's questions into one. It's really about the collaborative processes that underpin the success of integrating these qualifications. So how important is that? And relatedly, do dual sector universities have an advantage here in setting up these types of arrangements? Did you find that that worked better because they already had some kind of collaborative nature or collaborative relationship?
Wonderful questions again, Tabitha and audience. In terms of collaboration, I did mention that relationships was one of the characteristics, one of 4 characteristics of sustainable high integration arrangements. So collaboration is super important. In the report, we also refer to competition between providers. So increasingly higher ed and vet providers are in competition around the middle of the AQF band, diplomas, advanced diplomas, associate degrees. So there's, and higher ed diplomas, it's a complex mix there, and there's so much competition in there. So in that kind of environment, it becomes actually harder to set up the good collaborations that are needed for this kind of qualification to work. So where we found functional high integration examples, there was there were established processes for staff involved in both sides to meet and undertake other activities together, such as professional development. So there was a wonderful example that we saw in the finance, accounting, management area, where the 2 institutions were not directly competing. So that was important. We could see that, but there were staff on both sides who were actually working into the other part of the integrated arrangement, and there was that kind of a very respectful relationship had developed there, and that was clearly very important. But this brings us to the dual sector advantage. Yes, it can definitely be an advantage. So one of our examples came from a dual sector where the top level leadership had embraced the idea of a truly to become a true tertiary sector institution, and that was really helped being driven from the top. But you always needed those people on the ground who could understand, these 2 different types of curriculum that we see together, and could make it work on a day-to-day basis. However, even within dual sector institutions, vet and higher ed staff can drift apart culturally. So that they may be housed in different parts of the institution, and the daily realities of doing vet or doing higher ed, you're very much caught up in the funding, in the policy, in the regulation, and the language. And so you end up with different cultures that make it harder, even within the same institution, to do this kind of work.
Okay, great, Stephen. And I think we're going to have to leave it there, as we've definitely run out of time. A big thank you to Lizzie and Stephen for talking about your project today. That's been really informative. And thank you all to all those who've attended today. I hope that you've found this really interesting, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Can I just jump in, Tabitha, and just mention, I saw a newspaper report very recently that picked up on this research. I wasn't so happy about the negative framing that it was putting there. We'd say the difficulties here lie in the system, lie in the systems behind the tertiary field, that providers can do really good things, and there's plenty of success coming out of integration. The system makes it hard, that's all.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you, everybody.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tabitha. Thanks, Lizzie. Thanks, everyone.